Perfect. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And sorry, I'm the reason the time changed, so I apologize. One of the great things about being in a place that you adore, that has such a vibrant community, is that you get to dip in and dip out of different conversations. So I'm really, really grateful to be here. I'm excited for the Center on Interdisciplinary Legal Studies. As someone that's always felt out of place from different disciplinary homes, interdisciplinarity was one of the few places I felt at home. David Wilkins calls Law and Society scholarship the space of the misfits, like it's where all the misfits hang out. And I've come to think of being a misfit as a positive tag rather than as a negative tag, right? It's like you can queer the word misfit as a good thing. It's not, I mean, when I started, I remember people telling me, pick a lane, pick something that you want to do. Like, don't be between categories because that's going to be hard when you go on the job market. How many of you are grad students in the room? Or doing some kind of either a PhD student or a postdoc or someone that's like trying to navigate research? Anybody in the room? So, okay, yeah. So I think at different stages, this work gets coded differently. I think now that being middle-aged has many advantages, and one of them is you don't have to justify what you do, right? Like somehow the things that I had to justify so much when I was a grad student, now I get celebrated for, and it's like such dissonance because you don't, it's not that my work has changed. I mean, I'm really lucky. Esra is here. Esra is one of my grad school besties, right? And now lives in Hong Kong. And I remember so clearly, we have the same advisor, and I remember so clearly being in grad school thinking, international students in American disciplinary program, we both were in a sociology program at Stanford, were always seen as both either keen to do the thing exactly like American disciplinary scholars do it, right? To get seen as good, or doing our own thing on our own terms and being seen as really odd. And I think I was odd through grad school. I think I remain odd. But when I was in grad school in a disciplinary program that was law adjacent, so it wasn't housed in a law school, it was sort of law adjacent, it was seen as cool to have, but not necessary to have, right? I tell grad students this all the time. I applied to 136 jobs over 4 years and was rejected almost consistently until I got the one job I got. Now, when you look at my resume, it can seem like my entire career seems linear and somewhat advantaged by a lot of different spaces. But it was the only commonality in all my experiences was that it was precarious. At every stage, it was precarious. At every stage, it felt like I didn't know what the next thing was. And no one around me knew what the next thing was. And I think part of why I wrote this piece that I don't know some of you read because it's open source. I'm happy to send you the link if you haven't read it yet, is trying to think through what it means to be out of place, right? So I started doing this work when I was in grad school, and I was very out of place. Doing a PhD program, I was very out of place, as I just said. And placing oneself in this space between categories seemed like the only authentic position for me. Right. So when I was in grad school, I didn't know what I was, but I knew what I was not. I was not a pure sociologist. I was not a pure quantitative scientist. I was not a pure lawyer, right? I was interested in the humanities. I was interested in social science. I was interested in culture. I was interested in global languages and, feminist and queer theory. And none of these places were my full homes, right? And it's a hard place to be between all these different big categories. And I call it agoraphobia in this piece. But that's what it felt like. And I didn't have the word for it until I was teaching a class called Guilt. It's a class on gender and queer theory. I call it Gendered Understandings in Law and Legal Theory. I love acronyms, as you can tell. So it's called Guilt. And when I was teaching the class, one of my students, right, who was very thoughtful in the memos that he would submit, but would be quiet in class, like almost like struck in class, one day wrote to me and said, the reason I can't speak in this class is because I'm having almost an agoraphobia, of all the material you have been making us read. And I say that as a compliment, not as a limitation. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like that is what I have done to the student, but it's also what has been done to me, right? Every time I would present work, somebody from a different discipline would say, yeah, but what about this? And I would say, yes, that's exactly what it is, and go down that little road, right? So I would speak to a gender theorist and they'll be like, well, is this really liberal feminism? What if your research was something else? And I'd be like, yes, that's what it is, right? And I kept responding to people and audiences so much that it both made my research richer, but also gave me this constant feeling that I was actually in no place. And it's a really destabilizing way to feel. Like if you're a majority world scholar from India, like all my core degrees are from India, so I didn't go to the US until I went to law school. If you're a majority world scholar working within very scripted American norms, and Hong Kong's interesting because it's a different kind of majority minority world space, right? Like it's a mashup differently. It becomes important to have language that translates and makes generalizations, but also to have your own, like to know what your authentic voice is. So I wrote this piece. So Lynette Chua, who a lot of you might know, who's a big Asian Law and Society scholar, and Mark Massoud are friends from the Law and Society Association. And so when they were trying to get together pieces for this book, which is an amazing collection, I remember thinking, well, I can write about how my positionality has changed over the last 10 years and how I've been out of place differently. And being out of place as a graduate student is very different from being out of place as a tenured senior professor who runs 2 centers, right? Now being out of place is cool. Now being out of place means I get invited in December to Hong Kong to come and talk to you all. But being out of place in exactly the same way, my research hasn't changed that much. I'm still interested in kooky things that could be cool or could not be cool. But they're coded very differently if you do enough of it over a period of time. And that's sort of like what I'm interested in, right? Like how does that positionality change? And how do we change with it? So I don't know if anybody here sort of knows the broad arc of my research. Sometimes when speakers come, you read broad things about them. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm interested in like sort of inclusion broadly and the liberal politics of what inclusion does. So I'm really interested in how good inclusion policies actually exclude a lot of people while looking good. So my first book was called Accidental Feminism. It came out in 2021. It's a book on how women in very elite Indian law firms are very successful at senior levels of partnership, even though the country has a very low percentage of lawyers who are women, right? So I'm trying to like think through, why does gender work in this way? What does it look like for a Western audience versus what is it actually doing in the Indian context? And I call it accidental, just to think through how sometimes without intention, good outcomes can happen. And often the way we think about non-intention is to say, well, despite good intention, bad things happen. So I was trying to flip that script a little bit and be like, what do we do with things that look good, but didn't have any intention, that we still are sitting uneasily with? So that was my first book. My second, I have a couple of other books, but the next big project that I'm working on is a project called Blase. And it's on how people who are non-binary, so when you are gender ambiguous and between categories, how is it received? And how do people not think it's a problem if they misgender you or they call you something else, right? So I get she, heard a lot. And when I do and I correct someone, usually they'll look at me and be like, really, is that a thing young people do now? Like in a way that they would never call me Sue. And I'd say, no, my name is Swethaa. And they would never slip up on that, right? Like it's very similar to how I call it blasé because I think it's not, there's an intention to erase you while looking like it's actually indifference, right? There's a certain mechanism that's sociological, and I argue that it's because the legal category is between defined legal categories. If there were actually protections for non-binary people that were universal, that would not happen. But because there isn't a legal category that captures it, people think it's actually personal preference, which is why I hate the word preferred pronouns. I was like, what is preferred about it? This is my pronoun. It's not preferred. It's not my preferred name is not Swethaa Ballakrishnen, right? It is my name. So thinking through, so it's a history of non-binary navigation. And that's the next book. But in the middle, I've done work on sort of cosmopolitan immigration. I do a lot of work on legal education. So I do work on friendship networks in law school and how they change over time. I have another project on movies and how queerness has always been obvious in South Asian movies. We just don't call it queer because we understand that censorship works a certain way. And actually that makes it even more, not less queer, right? Like thinking through, really everybody thinks of queerness as sexual choice. And I'm arguing that, well, not everyone. There's a majority understanding of queerness as sexual choice. And I'm suggesting that, well, queerness has always existed in this spectrum logic across contexts in very mainstream scripts in the global South. You just don't call it queerness because it doesn't fit within neat categories of what queerness does in the global North context, right? So that's sort of like what the next couple of projects are. So that's the map of what I work on. So I use, as you can imagine, I use a range of methods. I do like historical archive stuff. I do ethnography, interviews. The network studies on large data sets and network analysis over time with the same sample, so time series data. And in all of this, the one thing that remains constant in my methods is I am committed to having my positionality obvious no matter what I write, right? So if I'm writing a book, my book starts with like a discussion of my non-binary identity and how my mother responded to it, right? My next book, which is about non-binary identity, will probably talk about something else. But the point is I always talk about who I am and where I start from. And so when I gave up my book talk for the first book, one of the first talks that ever happened, and this is before the reviews had come out, it won a couple of awards, but this was before all of that, right? So before we knew whether the book had landed or not. I was an assistant professor, I didn't have tenure, it had just come out. And I knew this was going to be the book that either made it or not, right? So I remember the book coming out and an audience member saying, this is such a good book. Like, why did you have to make it so personal at the start? You have such amazing data. And I find this to be an incredible starting point to think about the ethics of research. Because what the person was saying is, you can start reading this book and thinking this is just an autoethnography of your feelings, but actually you had amazing data. Like, why did you frame it in this way? Why was it personal, right? Like, why did you talk about your queer journey? And I was like, well, actually, it's my book, so I'm glad I spoke about my queer journey. But I think it's almost ethical. And the point I'm making in this piece, and I hope to make today, is that there's something highly ethically necessary for a researcher to tell you their priors. Because if a researcher doesn't tell you their priors, and my priors are, I am from the global South, I have local North advantages, that's what I call my internal advantages of being, English speaking, having parents that went to college, having grandparents and great-grandparents that went to school. All of those things are local advantages, but they don't translate in quite the same way because I went to the US on a full scholarship. I'm financially responsible for every adult in my family, which is not true for others who have very similar local advantages as me. So there's nuance in the local advantages and the global disadvantages I might have. And all those things make up my identity and it makes up my scholarship. So you can't read something I write and assume that the person writing it has a blank slate because no person has a blank slate and all of us are interpreting data based on our biases. So part of the argument I make in this piece is if you are, no matter what your identity is, being very clear about it is a necessary ethical part. So I teach legal ethics to first years. So this is my big law school class, right? Being honest and self-reflexive about your positionality is an ethical starting point for doing research. So it's not whether the research is, someone will say, well, it's quantitative research. Like, why does your positionality matter? And I would argue for everything positionality matters because how you read regressions are biased based on what you want to read, right? How you're actually reading the slant in which analysis happens is predicated on what you think your starting points are, right? Like if you were, the assumption that large data is somehow less biased than ethnography is ridiculous, right? Because it's all biased in some way. Some are more biased because it's obvious that their biases are built into the analysis. And in others, you can argue that they are normative or neutral. And so neutrality is what I'm trying to figure out, right? I'm like, actually, nothing is neutral. You are assuming that certain liberal understandings of methods are neutral. and suggesting that the rest are not. And both those things are doing an injustice to how research actually gets done. So what does it mean to actually have the positionality of your ethics clear? The first is to recognize that your position is not the same, right? So I started my first book when I was a graduate student. I did all of the research. So I was studying very elite lawyers. I was a grad student. Um, and I was sort of not really on a paycheck, right? Like I was doing it with research grant money. And that power relationship between me and my interlocutors was different than the research I did as a postdoc in a village, like I did a ethnography in a tiny village in South India, in Kerala, on women left behind when their partners go to work in the Gulf. Now, in that research, I was an outsider in a very different way. I was an outsider because I was an outsider in the village. They knew I was from somewhere else, but they weren't sure how to code me, right? They thought I was an American academic. I was not. I was from Abu Dhabi at the time, but they thought I was foreign enough that they thought I was different. They didn't want to actually open up to me. But once they opened up to me, the difference between them and the interlocutors in my first project was that in my first project, these partners could read my book and say, I'm sorry, this is shit. I didn't say this. Right? Like, so they had enough power to challenge anything I wrote in my data. They were very high elite, like sort of interlocutors. And I was studying up, right? Because I was a grad student, they were fancy lawyers. And at every stage, anything I wrote could be challenged by them as not a good representation of fact, right? So even though at the time I was like, I'm a Harvard researcher, I'm from Stanford, right? You could drop these names to get access into these elite spaces. Once you were in them, after you'd written it up, they could challenge you. So the power worked differently. In the ethnography, when I was in Kerala and doing sort of research in Malayalam, which is like one of the languages I speak, but don't speak it very well, the difference is that they knew I was an outsider. They didn't care what kind of outsider, because those cues didn't mean the same thing to them. They knew I was an outsider and I couldn't be trusted. So it took me longer to create trust to get them to like speak to me. But the difference is they're likely not going to read anything I wrote from it. I actually couldn't bring myself to write from that project because I do think there's something about the politics of studying up that allows me to write better than studying down, like the anthropological logic of, I couldn't bring myself to write from that project. And I still wonder about the ethics of that. I'm like, well, they can never recheck it. Should I write from it? They could, because I'm not writing in Malayalam. I'm not going to go back and share this with them. And the ways I was reading it, I wasn't fully sure I got it. So I actually abandoned that project midway because I felt like this wasn't something I could fully understand the ethical recursive knowledge production logic of. So that's sort of to give you a sense of like why positionality matters in terms of ethics and in terms of methods. The second part of it is the legal ed research that I'm doing. I was doing it first as a professor, and then it's like now I'm the associate dean, right? So these students that are speaking to me are responding to an email that has my signature that says, I mean, like a bit like that, like this giant signature that makes me seem like a much bigger human than I am. And when I say, hey, can I speak to you? They're saying, yes. Well, I mean, what are they going to say? They're not going to say no, right? And then they expect that in that exchange, when I do interviews with them, and I tell them this all the time, I'm like, please stop me if you think you don't want to answer something. Please stop. No, this is completely anonymous, but I can, redact anything you don't want me to say. And they never push back in a way that in my first project, people would stop me and say, no, I actually don't feel comfortable talking about that. Make sure you redact ABC. But the students are eager to actually share with you, A, because there aren't a lot of spaces where they can share, and B, because what are they going to say? They're going to tell the dean, like, sorry, I don't want to talk to you about this redact, like, 1 minute and 13 to minute and 18. They're not going to do that. And so thinking through power in these places, I think, is really important. And writing about it is really important. So then the reader, when they're reading it, knows the context within which to read your results. And I think that's where I'm getting with this ethics argument, right? So you can't not do this because your positionality shifts over time, right? It's true that I'm a global South queer with a lot of, local advantages, but that positionality has shifted over time from when I started writing to now, right? I mean, whether I have power for those positions versus not having power is different in every stage of that writing and reading process. And so until I'm actually clear about it, I don't think the internal and external validity of the claims I make sort of do quite the same work as I want to do. I'm at 20 minutes. I want to spend the last like few minutes to finish this up thinking about vulnerability. So I argue in this piece, and I argue more generally, that there is a politics to vulnerability, and that the more power you have, the more onus you have to be vulnerable, right? And vulnerability sometimes can be seen as false closeness, right? So when you do a lot of vulnerability with a student, for example, they can read that as you doing closeness in a way that they can misinterpret as, oh, this means no matter what happens, Professor Ballakrishnen is going to write a tremendously positive recommendation, which is not what you're trying to do. Or they can read it as, oh, like, I mean, I can ask them 1 hour before I need something and they will do it because we're buddies, right? Which is also not what you want. But I think in methods, I think vulnerability politics is really important because your reader is doing you a faith in trusting that you're saying what you're saying within the context that you're saying it. So having vulnerability as an ethical standard of how you do writing is really, I think, crucial. So the way in which I did this, for example, was in my first book, I have an entire chapter on research methods, which is not like the general, I collected this many data, I did this, and then this is the framework. I did all of that. But I also really wrote it as an appeal to graduate students. Someone asked me, who did you write that part of the book for? And I was like, I wrote it for graduate students because there are going to be times when you don't think your book is ever going to be read, right? And then you're like, why am I being this vulnerable in this for? Because no one's going to read it. And like, it almost feels like, it feels so pretentious to imagine that you already have a reader and that they want you to be vulnerable to them. But I actually think the opposite is true. When you write with vulnerability, it makes the book more real. It gives it actually coordinates for who your reader is. And until you know who your reader ought to be or you want it to be, it gets harder, especially with these large, wielding projects that you don't know where it starts and where it ends. It becomes really hard to clarify your argument if you don't know who you're doing the vulnerability for or on behalf of. And so that's the last thing I'll end with, which is, being out of place. I think all of socio-legal politics, right? Like interdisciplinarity is all about being out of place, but marking the coordinates of what kind of out of place you are is crucial for an ethical positionality as an interdisciplinary scholar. That is how you clarify what it is you want the reader to read. And while doing it, I would just say, leaning into vulnerability is always discouraged because it's seen as not good neutral. And I would argue that actually it is the only neutrality you can offer because everything is not neutral. And vulnerability allows you to peel back and actually explain the ways in which your particular neutrality can serve or not serve the audience that is reading and engaging with it. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry again for changing the date and time on you, but thank you for being such an awesome audience. And I look forward to actually speaking and responding to questions and comments and thoughts that you might have. Thanks.